All right. Hello and welcome to the second program in our webinar series, which is brought to you by Georgia Homeplace, a project of the Georgia Public Library Service. Today's webinar is titled On Second Thought, Reappraisal and Deaccessioning of Archives and Special Collections. Please note that due to technical issues with the original recording, this is a re-recording of the presentation, and as such will not include participant questions or chat box discussion. Today's presentation will be made available in both the GPLS Learning Center, which is learning.georgialibraries.org, and our YouTube stream at youtube.com/user/Georgia Public Library. These links will be emailed to all participants once the recording is available. Documents from today's webinar can be found at bit.ly, that's bit.ly/2XYLZGU. CE credit is available for those participants that require it. Please contact Dorcas Davis at ddavis@georgialibraries.org to request the certificate. My name is Angela Stanley, and I'm Director of Georgia Homeplace for the Georgia Public Library Service. We are so pleased to be able to bring you this series on managing public library archives and special collections. I'd like to take a moment to briefly share some information about Homeplace and the Digital Library of Georgia. Homeplace is an acronym standing for Providing Library and Archives Collections Electronically. Georgia Homeplace encourages public libraries and related institutions across the state of Georgia to participate in the Digital Library of Georgia through digital projects, trainings, and consultations. Homeplace is made possible through the support of LSTA funds administered by the Institute for Museum and Library Services. The Digital Library of Georgia is a Galileo initiative based at the University of Georgia Libraries that collaborates with Georgia's libraries, archives, museums, and other institutions of education and culture to provide access to key information resources on Georgia history, culture, and life. The primary mission is accomplished through the ongoing development, maintenance, and preservation of digital collections and online digital library resources. Please visit our websites at georgialibraries.org/homeplace and dlg.galileo.usg.edu for more details. If you'd like to subscribe to the DLG's listserv, through which the partner newsletter is distributed quarterly, please visit bit.ly/DLG news. These links will also be posted shortly. You can hear more about the development of the Georgia Historic Newspapers website, as well as updates on collaborative newspaper digitization efforts at both the Georgia Libraries Conference and the Society of Georgia Archivists annual meeting, where Donnie Summerlin and I will be reporting on our work. We also have an upcoming event, Introduction to the New Georgia Historic Newspapers website, on September 28, 2017 at 2:00 p.m. That presentation will be given by Donnie Summerlin, Digital Projects Archivist at the Digital Library of Georgia. You can register online at georgialibraries.org/homeplace. And there's that information about the upcoming conferences. If you have a question about the webinar series or are interested in offering a presentation that would benefit public librarians managing archives and special collections, please send an email to me at astanley@georgialibraries.org. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Carrie Hintz is the Head of Collection Services at Emory University's Stuart A. Rose Manuscript Archives and Rare Book Library. In this role, Carrie oversees the manuscript processing, rare book cataloging, and collection management functions for the library, including having primary responsibility for overseeing and managing the Rose's reappraisal and deaccessioning activities. She is an active member of the Society of American Archivists and has served in leadership positions on the Women Archivists section and the Standards Committee. During her tenure as co-chair of the Standards Committee, the committee oversaw and approved SAA's revised Guidelines for Reappraisal and Deaccessioning. Prior to coming to Emory, she served as the head of archives processing at Columbia University's Rare Book and Manuscript Library. She holds an MSI in Archives and Records Management from the University of Michigan and an MA in American Studies from Columbia University. Carrie is particularly interested in developing and managing sane, efficient, standards-based technical service programs and special collections. And now I'm going to hand it over to Carrie for her presentation. All right, Carrie, there you go.
All right, excellent. Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to On Second Thought, Reappraisal and Deaccessioning of Archives and Special Collections. So I'm guessing most of us are here today because we have some of those collections in our repositories. You know, the ones that either don't have any documentation or you can't determine clear ownership status. Maybe they're in terrible physical condition, or they're permanently restricted or have no discernible research value. Or maybe they're just really far of left field from what your institution usually collects or has expertise in. And so now you want to know legally, ethically, and practically what your options are for dealing with these collections. So today, I'm going to be talking about some reasons your repository may want to undertake a reappraisal and deaccessioning project or program. I'll go through some strategies for doing this in a responsible way. And I will give you some practical tips on how to actually implement and manage these reappraisal and deaccessioning activities. But before we get into it, what am I even talking about when I talk about these things? What is reappraisal? SAA Glossary defines reappraisal as the process of identifying materials that no longer merit preservation and that are candidates for deaccessioning, which I think is definitely a really good start on a definition. But there are some nuances there that this definition doesn't catch. If you look at the definition of appraisal in the SAA Glossary, it's the process of identifying materials offered to an archive that have sufficient value to be accessioned. So I favor Mark Green's definition of reappraisal that expands on SAA's a little bit as the application of existing collecting and appraisal criteria to material already in your repository. So it's essentially a revisiting of our collections and holdings to reevaluate whether they continue to have sufficient value to the repository and to our users to warrant continued retention. This also addresses the fact that many of the collections held in archival repositories may not have ever been appraised in the first place, or may have been collected before we had formal collecting policies to guide these appraisal decisions. This is the general line of thought that Leonard Rapport puts forward in his article, No Grandfather Clause, Reappraising Accessioned Records, where he recommends shifting our appraisal and collecting thinking away from considering records with permanent value to thinking about retaining and maintaining records worthy of continued preservation. So essentially, we can think about reappraisal as a methodology for maintaining collections with high research value that a repository can manage responsibly and that allow enough space for us to continue to collect and preserve the material that's really core to our mission. So reappraisal may, but no means always, leads to deaccessioning. And deaccessioning, also per the SAA Glossary, is either the process by which an archives, museum, or library permanently removes accessioned materials from its holdings, or it's the actual act of removing these archival resources from our intellectual and physical custody. So essentially, the removal of all or part of an established collection from our holdings. One of the things that deaccessioning is not, it is not weeding. It applies to either entire collections or to series, not to items within a series. Also, reappraisal and deaccessioning are not the same thing. Reappraisal may lead to deaccessioning, but it may not. And deaccessioning will often result from reappraisal, but deaccessioning can also be driven by other forces. So while these are often spoken about together, reappraisal is an archival function that's part of a comprehensive collection management strategy, and deaccessioning is one potential outcome of undertaking that function. So now that we're all on the same page, Who does this? Anecdotally, there seems to be a sense that reappraisal and deaccessioning is some sort of fringe activity rather than a core archival function. The research, though, shows that this is work that most institutions do, and that they do it successfully and regularly. In the spring of 2017, Marcella Huggard and Laura Jackson conducted a survey of reappraisal and deaccessioning practices across North America. They received 489 responses from institutions of all types across the US and Canada, and they found that 89% of institutions surveyed practice reappraisal or deaccessioning to some extent. Their survey included a broad range of institution types, including academic archives, historical societies, museums, public libraries, and government institutions. And across all of these institution types, the most common reason given for not reappraising material was a lack of need to. So it wasn't that there was a lack of time or administrative support or a fear of negative consequences or bad publicity. It's just that those institutions felt that they had well-scoped and sized collection for their institution. So institutions are tackling this regularly and at various scales. The Libraries and Archives of Canada Clearing the Path project from 2007 to 2008 got rid of 5 kilometers of records deemed non-archival, while many reappraisal projects are undertaken to manage a small number of problematic collections. So we know that a lot of institutions are reappraising. But why? Why would a repository want to undertake a reappraisal project or be looking to deaccession some legacy collections? So there are lots of reasons why you might want to reassess your collection or potentially remove collections from your holdings. And these are reasons both strategic and practical. And we'll talk about the practical first. On a practical level, there's a number of reasons why you might want to reassess retaining a collection. First, there are physical considerations. These could be serious preservation concerns like pervasive mold or physical deterioration that makes a collection unusable. The collection may be in a format that's not collected by your institution. So, for example, if your repository does not have and doesn't intend to ever build a digital archives program, retaining a collection of floppy disks is probably not the most rational decision for your repository. Similarly, if you're a photo archive and you have one collection that is all textiles, that might be a good candidate for reappraisal and possible deaccessioning. You may also have formats that are permanently inaccessible due to obsolescence or physically degraded to the point of uselessness or have become a danger to staff and users. There may also be legal reasons that warrant reconsidering a collection or parts of a collection in your repository. So perhaps you find yourself holding documents that were, at some point, illegally seized and the rightful owner is taking action to request them. This is known as repletion, and many states and state governments will actually take action to repatriate government records that are held in private hands. So while that's not a super common scenario, you may discover that you have material in your collection that, based on your parent institution's retention schedule, was scheduled for destruction and erroneously made their way into the archives. You may also have collections with unknown provenance and zero documentation that you're not sure if you have the legal right to own or to allow researchers to access. Other access issues that may spur reappraisal could be having a collection that is indefinitely restricted, that you cannot open to research, or if you have a collection that has not been used or sees very, very infrequent use. Or you may have a collection or set of collections in a collecting area that just doesn't ever seem to have taken hold in the research community, and there's no foreseen scholarly or other interest in whatever topic you've been collecting. There's also some really good collection management and repository management reasons to think about reappraisal, especially taking on a systematic reappraisal program. Doing a systematic reappraisal of your holdings may give you a chance to get better control over unmanaged or undescribed collections, to address broad duplication of items or information across your holdings, potentially to make split collections whole if they're split across institutions, and to better balance research potential of collections with the necessary allocation of resources like space, staff time, conservation resources that are required for the care and preservation of those collections. Getting a better sense of what you have may also help you to assess and prioritize your backlog. And finally, one of the most compelling reasons to undertake reappraisal and deaccessioning is to better align your collections with your institutional mission or collecting focus. And in fact, Huggard and Jackson's survey bears this out. They found that the top reason that most institutions initiated reappraisal and deaccessioning activities was to find out the scope of their collections and to refine them. Collections and repositories, be they museums, archives, libraries, or other cultural institutions, are part of and reflect a broader mission instead of institutional priorities. And things like missions, priorities, and resources will change over time if your institution is to remain strong and relevant. Therefore, your collections may need to change to remain in line with the institutional mission and priorities. The American Alliance of Museums Code of Ethics for Museums states that deaccessioning is part of a long-term, thoughtful decision on the part of the museum about how to best fulfill its mission with its available resources. Thoughtful archival management, therefore, will take into consideration both our responsibilities to our public and the responsible use of our likely limited resources when making decisions about which collections we will put and keep on our shelves. So now that we know why we would look to do reappraisal, when does it make sense to undertake this type of work? So a recent reappraisal project is like any other project in your library. You're going to need to spend some time in advance thinking about what you want to do, what you want to achieve, and what the actual capacity is to get this done within your institution realistically. Are you looking to address a small number of known problem collections, or are you hoping to undertake a systematic reappraisal program? It's important to define this scope up front. Reappraisal can be done across the repository's complete holdings or limited to certain subject areas, time periods, or formats. You can also choose to undergo reappraisal to advance administrative needs, such as reappraising all of the collections that don't have deeds of gift, or assessing the collections that are on deposit or loan to determine if you would like to continue to house unaccessionable material. On a practical level, you will also want to ask yourself, what do you hope to gain? And do you have the bandwidth to do it? Do you have the staff and capacity to undertake the size of project you're hoping to? Determine what you gain and if your reappraisal project is actually worth it. And that gain, it may be stack space, it may be clarifying the institution's mission, it may be monetary from the sale of the deaccessioned collections, and it may be the staff time that is saved by not spending time processing or providing reference services to for unwanted collections. Essentially, what is your cost-benefit analysis here? Will the resources saved outweigh those spent to do the reappraisal? Additionally, do you have buy-in from administrators of your parent institution? Reappraisal and deaccessioning are shared responsibilities, and they should be undertaken in partnership with the full knowledge and approval of key decision makers in the institution. You're going to need to go to stakeholders and outline your goals, objectives, and the anticipated outcomes of a reappraisal project. Communicate clearly who will do what, how, and when, and make sure that administration is kept aware of the reappraisal and deaccessioning process at all significant stages. So how? All right, let's assume that we know what we want to do and we have the ability to take on reappraisal. So how do we start? What steps do we need to follow, and how do you do it in accordance with the standards and best practices that are set out by professional organizations such as SAA and the American Alliance of Museums? The SAA guidelines for reappraisal and deaccessioning are a very good place to start. They provide really good, concrete guidance on how to proceed. So after you leave this webinar, they're definitely the first resource I would recommend for providing this kind of good, thoughtful, actionable guidance for doing reappraisal and deaccessioning in an effective and responsible way. As mentioned earlier, they were just revised this year, so they're quite current, they're up to date, and they're going to continue to be reviewed and revised every 5 years. But beyond the national standards and guidelines, the first thing you will need is a well thought out and clearly articulated ethical framework in which to approach reappraisal and deaccessioning. So reappraisal and deaccessioning collections for the primary purposes of generating operating income, satisfying personal interests, aversions, or prejudices, or to please donors or resource allocators is not okay. And none of those are consistent actions with best practices or the SAA Code of Ethics. You can only deaccession collections from your holdings that you have a clear title to and that either no longer reflect the mission of your repository, cannot be properly stored or managed, or is duplicated in other parts of your collection. So you should not be considering deaccessioning items that are core to your mission. Furthermore, all steps of the reappraisal and deaccessioning process should be documented, along with clear justifications for your decisions. The more transparent the process is, and the clearer your criteria for making reappraisal and deaccessioning decisions, the better. Even in the best of circumstances, deaccessioning can open your repository up to criticism or to negative press. So the more that you've thought through these ethical issues, the better equipped you will be to address any concerns or critiques that may arise. So the next thing that you will need is a solid policy framework in place to guide your decisions and to show stakeholders that your reappraisal and deaccessioning activities are part of a good faith effort, and your actions are all guided by the responsible and consistent application of a thoughtful and vetted set of institutional policies. And that policy framework will need to be grounded on a clear institutional mission and purpose. You'll want to have a clear mission statement for your repository or your larger organization from the get-go. You need to know in a broad sense what your institutional goals are and who your institution is intending to serve. Next, you will want a well-articulated collecting policy. So if you do not currently have a collecting policy, you will need to develop one before you proceed with any reappraisal or deaccessioning project. This document should identify what subjects or formats your repository particularly seeks to collect, as well as what you do not accept. A collecting policy or records management policy should support the repository's mission, and it should provide the archivist with the parameters of the collecting scope. You cannot make accurate and defensible deaccessioning decisions if you're not clear about what the repository seeks to acquire in the first place. Building on that, you will next need a deaccessioning policy. So this policy should specifically address reappraisal and deaccessioning, should define the authority and approval processes for making deaccessioning decisions, and identify acceptable methods of disposal. It should delineate acceptable expenditures of any potential revenue from the sale of collections, and identify a process for dealing with collections with unknown provenance. It should be formally approved by the repository administration, and for the sake of transparency, I would recommend making it available to the public or to the users of your repository as well. So once you have the proper institutional policies in place, you're ready to begin the process of reappraisal in earnest. You should already have an idea of whether you are planning to systematically reassess all of your collections in your repository against these current collecting policies, or if you're going to be targeting a smaller subsection of the collection. For each collection that you reappraise, you're going to want to ask yourself the following questions. Does this collection fit within the current collecting policy or records management policy? How often is it used? Would this collection and or potential users be better served if it were elsewhere? What condition is the collection in? What are the preservation and maintenance costs, and are they sustainable for your repository? So can you continue to steward the collection responsibly? What is the potential research value? Does the collection contain reproductions or copies of material that's available elsewhere? Is the collection or the series restricted under federal or state law? If the collection is restricted, does it have a lifting date that those restrictions lift? Must the collection or record series be kept for a certain period of time for legal or fiscal reasons? So now it's decision time. After looking at the collection in light of your current collecting and collections management policies, you will need to ask yourself if this is a collection or a series of a collection that has sufficient value to your institution and your researchers to warrant keeping the material and taking on the cost and responsibilities of stewarding it. At this point, the repository can choose to retain the collection, defer a decision, or deaccession the collection. If you retain the material, you'll want to make sure that it is described and accessible to your users. If a collection merits retention, then it is of sufficient value that it should be discoverable and usable. Sometimes a repository may not feel like it has enough information to make an appropriate decision about a collection. There may be complicated ownership issues to resolve, or perhaps the collection is not well enough described to determine its relevance to the institution's mission and collecting scope. In this case, document this decision and make a plan to reappraise within a certain specified period of time. If a collection or a portion of a collection does not meet the specified criteria for retention, the deaccessioning process will begin. The first step of this process is to ensure that your institution legally owns the collection and has the ability to lawfully and ethically remove it from your holdings. If there's language in the deed of gift that prevents deaccessioning collections or limits what destruction actions you can take on a collection, you must adhere to the terms of the original deed or reach out to the donor or the donor's heirs to renegotiate that deed. Additionally, if you're looking to deaccession a recently acquired collection, you want to make sure that you are following current IRS regulations around deaccessioning recent acquisitions. If a collection was appraised at over $5,000 and the repository signed Form 8283 at the time of acquisition, there's some additional IRS documentation that you will need to fill out if you want to sell, exchange, or dispose of the collection within that 3 years. So while again that's not super common and not the case for most of our collections, it is something to be aware of. If there's not a deed on file that shows clear ownership of the collection, you do still have a few options. First, if the donor is known, you can contact the donor or the donor's heirs to secure an agreement that allows for deaccessioning. So it's a good idea to send such communication through registered mail, both to ensure receipt by the donor or his or her heirs, and also to show that the repository has acted diligently to find the rightful owner of the material. If possible, it's always best to resolve ownership questions by working directly with the donor or their heirs. But if the donor cannot be located or there's other serious concerns with resolving questions through direct contact and negotiation, there may be some other options for determining or securing ownership. So one possible option is if you know that a donor took a tax deduction because of that Form 8283 that was mentioned, you can assume that they intended it as a gift to the repository and take that as a de facto disavowal of ownership. So this option does require a little bit more openness to risk on the part of your institution. So, and again, we don't usually have the paperwork that would allow us to do this, but it may be one option. And finally, you can attempt to acquire formal ownership through your state's abandoned property laws. Since I'm assuming a mostly Georgia-based audience for this particular session, I'm going to be focusing on Georgia laws. But SAA's Appraisal and Acquisition section conducted an abandoned property project not too long ago that gathered information about abandoned property laws across the U.S. and provides links to these state codes, and sometimes some additional guidance on what recourse cultural heritage organizations may have. So I have down here at the bottom, there is the URL for that project. So you can go ahead and take a look at that, and that may provide some additional guidance. So Georgia's laws are actually pretty favorable for cultural heritage institutions that are seeking to acquire formal ownership of abandoned or undocumented collection material. The Georgia Code has a section that's specifically about museum property, and it does call out and explicitly include archives in that section. So there's two sections of the code that are particularly relevant here. I've included the text of these statutes in the handouts that you will receive for registering for the workshop. And you can also go through LexisNexis to get free public access to the Georgia Code. But the first relevant section relates to abandoned property. So for cultural heritage organizations in Georgia, property is considered abandoned if the material has been in the repository for at least 7 years without any contact from the donor or the donor's heirs. Or if you have an original loan agreement that included a termination date, 7 years with no contact from the termination of that loan. So if you have something in your repository that has a known owner that has, say, been deposit at your institution for a decade or two with no contact from the owner, that property can be considered abandoned. So if you would like to secure ownership of that abandoned property, you will need to send a statement by certified mail to the owner's last known address, stating that the archive considers the collection to be abandoned property, and that if the owner doesn't submit a written claim to the collection within 60 days, then that ownership is going to transfer to the repository. A sample claim letter is also included in the handout for this workshop. So if the letter is returned, there is a process then where you can set out for making a public declaration to the same effect that this material has been abandoned and that the archives will consider it their property if no one claims it within a given period of time. So there are a few steps that you would need to go through to get recourse through the Abandoned Property Act. It's a little bit of time, but overall it's pretty straightforward to secure the ownership in this way. So this is the process that you use when you know the owner of the material. So when you don't have this information, there's a separate process for undocumented property. So undocumented property in this case is any collection in your possession that you don't have any kind of deed of gift or loan agreement for, you don't know the original donor or owner, and you don't have any reasonable means of determining who the owner might be, but can reasonably assume it was intended as a gift for the repository. Like, you know, those gifts that you come in on Monday morning and someone has left you a box of treasures outside the front door. This would be for this kind of situation. So in this case, if the material has been in the repository at least 7 years, and the repository would like to take ownership, it should put out a public notice similar to the one that was stipulated in the abandoned property section of the code. And if no claimants come forward to claim the material within 90 days, ownership transfers to the archives. So once you've secured rightful ownership of the collection material, you can now responsibly and lawfully deaccession it. So now that you have the legal ability to dispose of a collection, what are your options and how do you go about actually doing it? So as always, when making disposition decisions, you should document your decisions and rationale and be transparent about your actions. When removing material or collections from your holdings, you have 4 options. You can transfer to another repository, sell material, return it to the donor, or destroy it. So transferring the collection or other materials to another repository is an ideal option if the collection is being deaccessioned because it doesn't fit into your collecting scope, but it does have research value. This option keeps the collection open for public access and ensures its long-term preservation. It has the additional benefit that if your repository and the collection are a poor fit, moving it to a more logical repository may make it more discoverable to its potential research base. If another repository agrees to take the collection, be prepared to share the contents of the collection file with them so that they have all of the necessary documentation that they'll need to responsibly administer the collection. We want them to be able to adhere to any terms or restrictions that they may inherit along with the collection. You'll also, at this point, likely need to complete the receiving repository's deed of gift or other transfer paperwork. You will want to draft a deaccessioning memo for your own institution that indicates the disposition of the collection that you can file in the collection file. And if you have any kind of database or register, make sure to note in that system that the collection was transferred and the date that that occurred. You'll want to remove the finding aid or catalog record if you have them from your local system. And if there is an OCLC record for the collection, the holdings record should be transferred to a new institution. Removing a collection from your holdings doesn't mean that all traces of it disappear entirely. You want to make sure that the collection number or any other identifier should not be reused so that any legacy documentation that you remain in your repository and the old citations can all be appropriately traced. And if you do choose to transfer a collection, you should consider sending a courtesy letter to the donor or the heir explaining when and where the collection has been deaccessioned and transferred to. This part is not legally required, but taking this action can promote donor relations and help to avoid problems later. Sale of materials can also be a viable option in some circumstances. For example, in cases where a repository purchased a collection from a dealer, it might be appropriate to then sell collection material. Things that are non-unique or archival, such as published books or audio recordings or stamps or collectibles, may not have a great deal of research value, but may have some monetary value, and those could also potentially be appropriate to offer for sale. Before selling deaccessioned materials, you'll absolutely want to have written policies guiding these sales and the use of any proceeds. The policy should describe the conditions under which a sale could be considered and specifically address how the proceeds from the sale may be spent, such as purchasing new acquisitions, supporting collections through funding activities like processing, digitization, reference preservation, etc. The policy should also cover how the sales will be managed, whether it's going to be handled through an auction house, dealers, or otherwise, and should have provisions that employees of the institution and their family members are going to be ineligible to purchase or bid on deaccessioned collection material. While there's no one agreed upon ethical statement in the archives profession for how to handle revenue from selling collections, other allied professions do have clearer guidelines. For example, the American Alliance of Museums Code of Ethics states, the disposal of collections through sale, trade, or research activities is solely for the advancement of the museum's mission. Proceeds from the sale of non-living collections are to be used consistent with the established standards of the museum's discipline, but in no event shall they be used for anything other than acquisition or direct care of collections. So it's critical that reappraisal and deaccessioning should not be used to raise funds for budget shortfalls or emergencies. Sale of collections can be the result of the reappraisal and deaccessioning process, but it should never be the impetus or the driving factor for taking on reappraisal. So just make sure that your institution is aware of the potential risks and prepared to discuss or engage any criticism that might arise. Another option is to return the collection to the donor or to the donor's heirs. This may be a good choice if you cannot identify an appropriate repository for a collection or doesn't seem to have enough research value to warrant transfer. Those collections of clippings may not be something that other institutions are going to be interested in. It may be a good choice also if the collection contains material that is of low research value but potentially has sentimental value, or of course if the deed of gift stipulates that the unwanted collection material be returned to the donor. In this scenario, be ready to have an honest conversation with the donor about how and why you made the decision to deaccession the collection. It can be a slightly sticky situation, and it's an area where having clear policies and applying local guidelines and criteria consistently and equitably will be an important factor for maintaining donor relations. The final option is to destroy the collection. Records destruction may be mandated by law in certain cases, or institutional or government retention schedule. So destruction will also make sense if the collection presents a health risk, such as mold, if it's duplicative, obsolete, in very poor physical condition, or if it has a very, very low research value. So there are times in collections where putting in the effort to look for other repositories to transfer to, or contacting the donor's family may not be worth it. So just keep in mind that, again, some of those copies of things that are all photocopies or clippings may not be something that warrants looking for other repositories or the cost of returning to a donor. It's also good to remember that while you should be transparent in your actions, when you're destroying collections, it does behoove you to be discreet in your disposal choices. So use a secure shredding service or take some other safeguards to ensure that disposal is handled properly. And finally, it's extremely important that throughout this entire process, you document your actions. So this has come up several times, but it does bear repeating that the best way you can demonstrate that reappraisal and deaccessioning actions were taken in good faith, advance the repository's mission, serve your user community, and are part of good, appropriate, ethical stewardship of the collection is to record your actions and justifications at each step. You're going to want to retain and file all information gathered about the collection and creator, as well as all donor communication. As you're going through and doing this work, you'll also want to keep any forms or checklists or other paperwork that led to the deaccessioning decision and maintain readily accessible information about the disposition of deaccessioned collections. Done properly and documented fully, reappraisal and deaccessioning are a very effective way to make sure that your repository's collections remain core to your institutional mission. So I hope that I've been able to provide some thoughts on why an institution might want to undertake reappraising its collections, what factors need to be considered to do so appropriately, and some concrete steps to take when undertaking reappraisal and deaccessioning. I also hope that I've given some sense of how reappraisal and deaccessioning are two tools that can be valid and useful parts of a broader collection management and collection development strategy. I do believe that we need to think just as critically about what we keep on our shelves as what we put on them in the first place, and that we need to be very aware that keeping collections that don't reflect our mission impacts our ability to provide our users with collections that do and the services that support them. Thank you. Now we have time for some questions.
All right, thank you so much, Carrie, for that really clear and helpful presentation. Again to our viewers, because this is a re-recording, we will not be able to address participant questions at this time. But I do hope that viewers of this webinar found it useful to managing their collections and will look at implementing these best practices for reappraisal and deaccessioning in their own institutions. Do you have any final comments, Carrie?
No, just thank you all again for your time, and then I hope that the handouts that have been provided are useful, and the entire text of this talk is also included with the PowerPoint slides that will be shared with everyone as part of the packet of additional information.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right, so this concludes today's presentation. Thank you again for joining us today.